Hi, it's Ted Ritzer, host of the Greening Government Webinar Speaker Series. The series is a collaboration between my department, Alberta Environment and Parks, and the Alberta Climate Change Action Center, and the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. The format of the webinar is we have speakers that speak for up to a maximum of 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. The Q&A function you can access by hovering your mouse within the screen. Today we're so fortunate to be joined by Yuill Herbert of the Sustainable Solutions Group. And Yuill has worked for that firm for 15 years. But what's really interesting about Yuill, and we were joking about the age, and you know, to me, he's a young guy, right? But he's accomplished a lot within those 15 years, and I'll just briefly highlight some of those things that I think are worthy within the introduction. Yuill helped introduce the LEED for Homes rating system in Canada. He also co-developed the integrated design process used throughout Canada. And finally, Yuill has worked on or led more than 40 community and GHG plans and models for municipalities across Canada. So we are very fortunate to be the recipient of a presentation by, at the minimum, a national expert on this topic, Yuill Herbert. And with that, I will turn it over to Yuill. Thanks so much, Yuill.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here, virtually at least. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Transform TO, which is a major initiative for the City of Toronto, which it's very timely that we're talking about it today because it's going up to Council tonight for approval. So it's been through a committee, the Environment and Parks Committee at City of Toronto, passed unanimously there, and then is currently heading for the full council tonight. So it's going to be fascinating to see what happens with that discussion, and you can actually watch that live at City of Toronto Town Hall if you're really curious, and I'll be watching live for sure. So Transform TO was a 2-year project. We were involved for just over a year to explore low carbon pathways for the City of Toronto in order to achieve their target of 80 by 50, so an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And it's a particularly fascinating project because in addition to the greenhouse gas emissions lens, it also had the lens of considering equity, health, and prosperity, which are not pieces that we normally get to consider at this level of detail within a city plan. So the overall purpose of the project was to engage residents, other stakeholders, experts, and all city operations. And Toronto is a very large organization with many, many different departments. So working with those departments in itself is a significant endeavor to identify ways to reduce Toronto's greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2020 and by 80% by 2050 against 1990 levels. And the City of Toronto was looking for very specific, detailed pathways to get to those targets. Because one of the pieces that's fascinating about cities and other systems within society is that they experience a phenomenon called lock-in. And so investments made now really determine the future trajectory of energy use and emissions. And so Toronto was very interested in ensuring that the decisions that it's making now and the way it develops the investments it makes in infrastructure, transit, and so forth, are congruent with those pathways that take it to 80% reduction. So that was the overall purpose of the project. It was also a collaboration between the Atmospheric Fund and the City of Toronto itself. And the Atmospheric Fund is an entity that was given an endowment by the City of Toronto some time ago and operates at arm's length, working on energy, emissions, and clean air. So our particular element of the project was to do technical modeling. So we were developing a business as usual, what we call the business as planned scenario, and then short-term and long-term strategies. Then we were also looking at what the relationship between efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and equity, health, and prosperity outcomes are, and how we could actually evaluate those outcomes. And finally, we were using a structured decision-making process, which we used multi-criteria analysis. If anyone may or may not be familiar with that approach, but it's a very powerful decision-making approach when you have a lot of different dimensions that you're considering. And we were working with a multi-stakeholder modeling advisory committee, which included researchers, representatives of different organizations, business community, different departments within the city, a large group that we were working with who guided the modeling endeavor. For this project, we used a model that we launched last year, or no, 2 years ago in Paris, at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting when the Paris Agreement was signed. And it's called City Insight, and it's an energy, emissions, and finance model. And it's a really fun model. We partnered with another firm called What If Technologies out of Ottawa, who've been building these types of models for 20 plus years. And it's called a systems dynamics model. So it captures all of the feedback cycles between different elements of the urban system. And it's not only looking at the energy system, but it also places all of the different components of the energy system in space. So it's spatial. So we track where all the buildings are, how people are moving around the city, where waste is treated, wastewater is treated, where energy is generated. So all of these elements are actually in space. And then we can see how all the different pieces work together. And what we do is build a calibrated version. Calibrated means that we take observed data from a certain date. In this case, it was 2011. And then we make all of the components of the model, so the buildings component and the transportation system and all of those other pieces line up with that observed data, so that we know that when we run the model, we're working with a model that represents a particular point in time. And then we can generate future projections. So the base year that we use for Toronto is 2011. And if you look at the chart on the left, one of the fascinating parts and unusual parts for Toronto is that 56% of the emissions are associated with buildings. And typically in these sorts of projects, most of the emissions, or the majority of the emissions, are associated with transportation. And you can really see how Toronto is with a very building dense city, and therefore its emissions are dominated by buildings. And that's unusual. The impact of that is that natural gas is very high, and electricity is actually small, and this is in part because of the decreasing emissions factor for electricity in Ontario, which has gone down substantially since they phased out coal generation in the last little while. So that's the makeup of the GHG emissions by fuel type on the right. So we also spend a lot of time putting all of the buildings in space, and we use tax assessment data to do that. So we get very detailed information around the height of the buildings, the floor area, the number of buildings by type, all these different pieces, and they're allocated in space throughout the city. Then we take building or projections for the future, both for population and employment, and we generate a future projection in spatial, again in 3D, of the city. And so this is a representation of the city of Toronto in 2050 and what it would look like on a density basis. So this is population and employment per hectare. And you can see that there's a very strong concentration of that density in the downtown core. So once we have a projection of buildings, population, and employment in space out into time, we can then assess transportation. So we can look at how vehicles move around, the transit system, all of the different components, and we can come up with a very detailed future projection of the city. And so once we do that, then we can generate the greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions for the city of Toronto until 2051, assuming that no additional interventions are made by any other levels of government. And it's fascinating because right away you see a significant drop, a drop from 19.7 megatons in 2011 to 12.6 megatons in 2050. So why would it drop, assuming that no other government interventions are modeled? There's some key factors in here. One is actually accounting for the impacts of climate change. So the heating degree days, which are a major driver of those building emissions in Toronto, are expected to decrease significantly. So that has a big impact on driving down energy consumption, natural gas consumption, and therefore emissions. Another major factor is the introduction of fuel efficiency standards, the CAFE fuel efficiency standards that were first introduced by the US and then synchronized in Canada. And that has a significant impact on the transportation efficiency and subsequently transportation emissions. There's also some other factors like background rates of building retrofits and a continuing greening of the electricity generation within the city or within Ontario. So the result is that the business as usual projection declines, which was not an outcome that most people anticipated. Then once we have that business as usual projection, we're able to start looking at different actions. And this is a representation of energy density, spatially represented for the City of Toronto. And in this case, we're looking at locations where district energy might be viable. So we use a threshold of 140 megajoules per meter squared, which is a moderate threshold. It's possible it could be more ambitious. But using this threshold, we're able to identify which spots would make sense for district energy in 2050. And one of the fascinating parts of looking at 2050 is that we look at district energy after we've retrofit a lot of the buildings. If you introduce district energy and then retrofit buildings, you end up with much larger district energy systems than you need, and you reduce the cost effectiveness of those district energy. Basically, it's a bit of a stranded investment. So in this way, we're able to avoid that and capture the areas where it actually makes sense. Additionally, because our analysis is spatial, we're able to move buildings around. So move buildings from a zone that is just on the edge of being feasible for district energy, or from an area where it isn't feasible to an area where it's just on the edge. And all of a sudden, the zone becomes feasible and all the buildings in that zone can be connected to district energy. So in this way, you can use land use as a lever to enable district energy. We also spent a lot of time, transit is a major subject in Toronto, and we spent a lot of time understanding their projections of the transit system, and also if the transit system as projected made sense based on the population and employment projections out until 2050 as well. And we actually found that the planning context in Toronto is excellent. There's a very good correlation between where future development was planned and where future projected transit lines were planned. So we used a threshold analysis again, where we looked at certain levels of density of population and employment, and at certain levels of density, certain levels of transit make sense. So we looked to see if the transit systems that you would anticipate based on the projected density would be in place, and we found that they were. So that was reassuring. Obviously, Toronto faces a lot of challenges in actually building those transit systems, but from a planning perspective, it's very much aligned. We introduced a whole host of more than 30 different actions. This is an example of one of them, where we basically made significant chunks of the downtown car-free by 2050. And by making them car-free, we changed the trip, the mode of trips that both start and end from those areas that are car-free. And that has all sorts of implications for what kind of, the way in which people will get to those areas and the way in which people will leave those areas. We did a major program of retrofits. So we track all of the buildings by era, by building type. And so we're able to target very specific retrofits, retrofit programs to those buildings. And Toronto has a number of different retrofit programs already that target older condominium towers, that target single family dwellings, and also commercial buildings. And so we're able to narrow in specifically on which buildings we might want to retrofit and the levels of retrofit of energy savings associated with those retrofits. So the blue line represents, the dark blue line at the top here represents the total buildings built before 2016. And it declines because some of those buildings are destroyed over time and replaced with newer buildings. And then the lighter blue line represents the cumulative number of those buildings that have been retrofit out till 2051. So by 2051, we're basically retrofitting all of the residential building stock in the city. And as you can imagine, that has a lot of financial implications, as well as all sorts of health and other implications. And here's another fascinating analysis that we're able to do, which is because we track all of the trips in space, we're able to see that people are making. So if they're making them by walking, cycling, single occupancy vehicle, and so on, we're able to look at the length of those trips and say, well, is this trip viable for walking and cycling instead of personal vehicle. And this chart shows the trip distance. So on the left-hand side, a trip is 1 kilometer long, and the right-hand side is 25 kilometers long. And then it shows the mode of that trip, which is whether it's walk, bike. Bike is pink, yellow is transit, blue is personal vehicle. And then it shows how many millions of trips there are per year. So you can see that most of the trips are short trips in Toronto, and there's much fewer longer trips. So we really focused on those shorter trips, shift them to walking and biking, and we identified specifically which trips would make sense to do that with. But what we discovered is that even if you switched the majority of those short trips over, because the long trips are long by definition, even though there's fewer of them, a lot of the VKT are actually associated, vehicle kilometers traveled are associated with the long trips. And it's really difficult to switch those long trips for a variety of reasons. So we did put a lot of effort into dealing with the short trips, but the long trips are hard. So here's spatially vehicle kilometers traveled. So this is kilometers per capita per year. So how many kilometers each person drives per year. So it's between the lightest colors under 1,300 kilometers and the dark colors 2,700 to 4,800 kilometers per year. And you can see that the downtown core, which is in the middle of the map, has very few kilometers per year, whereas some of the outer areas have much higher. And this is the business as usual projection in 2050. And then this is the low carbon scenario in 2050 as well. So you can really, you can see some transit corridors very clearly appearing, where the colors shade, the shading of the color becomes lighter. And you can really see that the downtown core shifts further away from vehicles by 2050 in a low carbon scenario. But the outer areas remain very tricky to shift to non-vehicular modes. But once we'd done as much as we could shifting people out of vehicles, then we looked at electric vehicle scenarios. And we applied a number of different electric vehicle scenarios. This is the what's called an S-curve, and it represents different levels of uptake of EVs over the course of a population. And it's the way, S-curves are the way that population adopts technology. So it starts off slowly, speeds up, and then tapers off at the end. And the light blue line on the left is the one that we used for the low carbon scenario. And this represents new car purchases. So it's the percentage of new car purchases that are electric over time. And we used both Norway and Germany have targets of 100% electric vehicle purchases by 2030. So that's the one that we used for the low carbon scenario. The lines further to the right are projections that Ontario has developed provincially. And it's been fascinating because since we did this analysis, there's been a number of key studies that look at much faster rates of electric vehicle adoption than even we anticipated in this exercise, including a key one, I think, a couple weeks ago from MIT that has been getting a lot of attention. This represents what's called a wedge diagram, and this represents all of the different target or different actions to be evaluated for the City of Toronto to get on that low carbon curve. So the top line, the orange, just above the orange line, is the business as usual projection, and then the very bottom is shaded gray, is the low carbon scenario. So those are the remaining emissions under the low carbon scenario. And we got down to 3.9 megatons, which is more than an 80% reduction for the city. And this was a fascinating observation because we used only existing technologies. We didn't use any kind of magic technologies that are about to observe. We used fairly conservative technologies, solar PV, district energy, electric vehicles. So technologies that are much commonplace right now, but not necessarily wide adopted. And we applied those in incremental steps, and we found that it was feasible for Toronto to achieve this 80% reductions, admittedly with major capital investments, but very much feasible. This is a representation of how the end system changes in the business as usual scenario or business as planned scenario versus the low carbon scenario in 2050 in both cases. So if you look at the far right corner or far right side, you can see useful energy and conversion losses. And in the business as planned scenario, the total energy consumed is around 390 PJs, whereas in the low carbon scenario, it's around 180. So significant energy conservation elements associated with this low carbon scenario. One of the fascinating pieces is the conversion losses. You can see conversion losses in the business as planned scenario are 101 PJ, whereas in the low carbon scenario, they're 52. And conversion losses are the heat, the energy that's not able to be captured, but is consumed unnecessarily associated with some other use case. So for example, when you drive a car or an internal combustion engine, it releases a lot of heat, and that would be considered the conversion losses. What's fascinating is that electric vehicles are way more efficient than gasoline-powered vehicles, and those conversion losses from transportation decline massively between the low-carbon scenario and the business as planned scenario. And you can see that by the thickness of the line that goes from the conversion losses to the transportation sector in both cases. The thermal networks grows significantly in the low carbon scenario, and that reflects the significant district energy systems that are installed. And electric generation also grows significantly, and that's as a result of a wide introduction of photovoltaic throughout the city. So then I guess the only other piece to note is that commercial and residential buildings energy declines, and fossil fuel combustion also declines significantly, and that's on the far left-hand side of these charts. So here's the picture of the total energy consumption by fuel by sector. So the fuel types are along the x-axis, the sectors are along the z-axis, which is the 3D axis. And this is in the business as planned scenario in 2050. You can see significant natural gas along the back of the chart. Some emissions from waste and wastewater, and then gasoline and diesel from transportation. And this is what it looks like in the low carbon scenario. The natural gas is still there a little bit, but more or less gone. Gasoline and diesel are almost fully gone. So then beyond the energy and emissions element, we started looking at the health and prosperity aspects. So here's so in Toronto, 1,000 people are hospitalized every year, and about 280 people die from air pollution. And we found that in the low carbon scenario, we're basically not quite, but to a large degree, eliminating the combustion of fossil fuels within the city limits. And that has a major impact on air pollution. So by achieving this scenario, you're achieving major gains in health outcomes around associated with impacts of air pollution. And beyond the 280 deaths, the most significant impact is on children. So you're really helping issues like asthma and so forth by working towards this scenario. And that's a whole major driver for the low carbon scenario that I think will be explored in much more detail going forward. I think City of Toronto is looking at a specific project around that. We also look at the health impact of travel. So because for all those short trips I mentioned, people are walking and cycling in the low carbon scenario, we're getting a lot more people moving around. And when they move around, they get all sorts of health benefits from meeting other people as they're walking and cycling, which is a social capital benefit or anti-isolation benefit. You get improved fitness, which has a whole host of benefits for various chronic diseases. And so we're able to look at which neighborhoods are impacted by the increase in walking and cycling, and how many kilometers per capita walking and cycling would increase under the low carbon scenario. Another interesting health impact is noise. So noise has impacts on sleeping, on annoyance, on heart attacks. And so because we're reducing noise for two reasons, people are driving less, and you can see that most significantly in the downtown. It's driving's declined by -600 to -400 million kilometers per year. And not only is the driving decreasing, but by switching to electric vehicles, you're significantly reducing the noise associated with engine noise, basically. That actually, ironically, has a risk as well. And they're introducing sounds into electric vehicles now because they are so quiet that people don't know that they're there. So that has a little side effect. But in general, the noise levels in the city would decrease significantly, which has a range of health benefits. Additionally, people have much greater access to transit systems. And this is particularly important for lower income people who can't afford vehicles or who have trouble maintaining or operating vehicles. This chart basically shows the number of households that will have more frequent access to transit, and it goes way up. And then we looked at how the expenditures on energy. In general, in most neighborhoods, they go down. There's a few exceptions in light blue on this map, but the annual expenditures on energy will decrease. And we did an analysis both for business and households. So what would it take financially to get to the low carbon scenario? And because we have a stocks and flows model in which we track all of the building stock, all of the vehicle stocks, and so forth, we can assign detailed prices to all of those stocks and the incremental price of achieving the low carbon scenario versus the business as planned scenario. So total capital expenditures in Toronto in general range from plus or minus $12 billion per year. And this is for buildings, for vehicles, and for transit. Those are and energy systems. Those are the key stocks that we're looking at here. The incremental cost for the low carbon scenario peaks at about $6 billion per year and totals, when you've discounted at 3% discount rate, $60 billion between 2016 and 2050. So not a lot for a large city like Toronto. It also generates over 300,000 jobs. So those capital investments represent work or translate into work. And so you get all sorts of new jobs that are emerging. And a lot of these are associated with retrofits or renovations, which are by definition local. Some of them are not local. So some of them are with new expenditures on vehicle technologies, which may or may not occur, in this case in Toronto, or may occur somewhere else. But it's a significant stimulus for jobs. And we also looked at the impact of increased energy costs on neighborhoods by income level. So low income, we wanted to see if the low carbon scenario would have disproportionate income or impacts on low income neighborhoods. And we found that that wasn't the case. So in this map, we're looking at all the neighborhoods in the city by income level. And we found that the neighborhoods where energy prices did go up were not ones with high concentrations of low income people. And then finally, we looked at all the different actions by the cost that it would take to implement the action and whether they would generate a return or not. And to do this, we used what's called a marginal abatement cost curve, which shows the number of emissions reductions that are associated with the action on the horizontal axis, and then whether it costs money to implement those reductions on the vertical axis or saves money. So if it's negative, it saves money. If it's positive, it costs money. And so this is the cost curve for and 33% of the emissions reductions activities cost money, and the rest save money. So it's a significant opportunity. Most of these represent significant financial opportunities for either businesses, households, or the municipality itself. In addition to these, the final piece that we looked at is we wanted to know, we made a lot of assumptions, and we wanted to know if we adjusted those assumptions, how that would change the outcomes. So we did this process called sensitivity analysis, where you take some of the key variables and you adjust them and see what impact that has on the outcome. And we adjusted several hundred variables, and these ranges represent the impact. So the dotted lines represent the numbers that we've actually used, and the ranges represent the variation when you adjust the sensitivity. So this is adjusting things like the fuel efficiency standard of vehicles, number of heating degree days, energy savings associated with buildings, and so forth. But we felt that these numbers were still within a range that gave us fairly good confidence in the results. And so that's it. That's the story that I've presented so far. So I'll pause for questions.
Okay, so I'll just add for folks, if you could post any questions through the online Q&A window. So you just have to hover your mouse and post those questions. But That is fantastic, Yuill. That is just wonderful to hear. And maybe you could, while we're waiting for some questions, maybe you could tell us some of the other projects that you've been involved with. I mean, you were telling me that you're engaged with the city of Red Deer here in Alberta.
Yeah, I haven't personally been working too much on that project, but a little bit on the modeling side. But my colleagues have been working on a climate change plan for Red Deer, and also over the years we've done a number of other projects in Alberta. We worked on some of the early green building projects in Calgary, mm-hmm. In an area called the Bridges, which was were some really fascinating, innovative projects. This is going back 10 years or so. And yeah, some other interesting projects we worked on a GHG analysis for greenhouse gas emissions analysis for Yellowknife. And Yellowknife was a fascinating town because it's actually much more compact than you would expect and has a much higher mode share of walking and cycling than at least I would have anticipated. So that was a really fascinating piece. We're working on a lot of projects in Ontario right now. Some very ambitious energy and emissions projects or targets for some of the municipalities there. So things are moving very quickly in Ontario. It's fascinating to watch.
Oh, that's excellent. One of the questions that was posed, would a copy of the presentation be available? And of course, any of the folks, the way that you access the presentations is you go to YouTube and search for MCCAC, and that's where you'll find a copy of this presentation that Yuill just did. So certainly it's the idea of sharing best practices throughout government agencies, and you'll like within city administrations, what you're finding is really fascinating, and there were some surprises in that presentation of yours. I mean, I didn't expect, I thought there would be a direct impact on low income folks as far as a disproportionate impact on the low income folks, and that's not what you found.
Yeah, no, there are some interesting pieces around that, because typically there's some really important roles for public policy, because the low income households don't have the capital or access to the capital to, for example, retrofit their households, or they may not even own their households. So it's really important for the public sector to intervene in those cases to ensure that the benefits of this transition are not, that those people also have access to the benefits.
Mm-hmm. Well, while we're waiting for some more questions to come in, I would pose this question to you. It was interesting when Dr. Peter Arnfalk of Lund University presented. He presented on, I think it was about a 3-year study that they did on the impact the government of Sweden's policy on essentially business travel, and actually the policy on meetings. And what they found was by having a meeting policy that encouraged virtual meetings like we're doing now instead of business travel, they actually had a spread of about 19% reduction in CO2 emissions between those ministries that adopted that approach and used virtual meetings to those ministries who did not use that approach. So it's kind of like it's interesting, lots of people are talking about autonomous vehicles and investing a lot of money in researching those, but it's kind of like, well, if you just eliminated or reduced travel using vehicles entirely.
Yeah, and we actually modeled a 4-day work week for Toronto as well, for a number of the businesses in the city of Toronto, or in Toronto, for exactly that reason, and that had a significant impact.
Oh, that's okay. So what was that impact of the 4-day week? I mean, that sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the 4-day work week could just translate into longer work days. That could be one way that it rolls out. But the major impact is you basically take 1/5 of the work, home to work and work to home trips out of the equation. Not quite 1/5 because there's some rebound effect and that people drive a bit more on those days when they're not working, but it does have, that's the essential impact. So depending on how many businesses or how many employees that you apply it to, that's the gain that you get on the transportation side.
Okay, so folks, now's your opportunity to pose questions to Yuill as far as here and now. So post some questions through the Q&A chat window. But as far as insights that you want to kind of leave people with, Yuill, I mean, we've got folks from, basically all levels of government here in Alberta, and certainly, lots of the municipal government folks are involved in this. What kind of words of wisdom would you like to pass on to cities here? Here's a question that's come in. Is there any estimate on the excess GHS emission needed for supplying energy to the electric vehicles? Power stations are outside the city area, but does the increased electricity demand have effects globally or provincially?
That's an interesting question. So you're basically taking a whole fleet of vehicles, which are currently powered and using gas or diesel, and you're switching them to electricity. And in Toronto, electricity is constrained, so they're already having issues with providing as much power as neighborhoods want, because the grid is old. And in fact, there's some neighborhoods that have been declared peak Tesla because they have too many Teslas and the grid can't sustain anymore. And so the local utility won't allow people to purchase Teslas in those neighborhoods. Those are obviously very high income neighborhoods. But it is a major problem. So the way in which the low carbon scenario works is that we have made significant efficiency gains on the building side, which more than exceeds the amount of electricity that is required to power the vehicle fleet. So overall, electricity use in the city of Toronto doesn't go up in the low carbon scenario. It actually goes down a little, despite shifting all of the vehicles from gasoline to electricity. And that's the value of the energy system through an integrated lens, because if you just looked at vehicles, you would have thought, there's no way we can do this. The grid can't sustain powering all these vehicles in addition to everything else out until 2050. But when you match it with retrofits, with major retrofits within the buildings, it does work. In terms of the impact on emissions outside of the city, Ontario has a relatively clean grid, which is a large part due to nuclear. So the impact isn't that significant of switching from gasoline to electricity for vehicles.
That's interesting that you mentioned nuclear, Yuill. What percentage of electricity within Ontario is generated through nuclear energy?
That's a good test for me. I think it's 40%.
Really, that high?
Yeah,
That's
it's high. Yeah. So it's fascinating in Alberta, for example, because the electricity emissions factor of the grid is much higher. If you switch to electric vehicles, you may not make that much of a gain, if any gain, because you're switching from gasoline to electricity, and electricity is very dirty. So it was. I think the trajectory is changing, but the immediate gain may not be that significant. Whereas in Toronto, it's a major gain, or BC, it would be a major gain, or Quebec, it would be a major gain.
Well, it's interesting when you look at the population distribution of Alberta, and I'm kind of filling in some time here waiting on other questions, Yuill, but the interesting thing when you compare Alberta to other provinces in terms of demographics is we have a fairly evenly spread distribution of cities within the province, from the south to the north, compared to BC or Manitoba, where you have concentrations in just one city. So given our population distribution, is there any kind of things that you can think of that we should be adopting that's a little bit different strategy for Alberta given the population distribution?
I don't know if that would make a big impact. I mean, a big impact on the overall strategies. think the first strategy, the most important strategy, is to green electricity, because as soon as you green electricity, then heat pumps make sense, so you can get off natural gas. Then you have a clear trajectory for heating of buildings. You have a clear trajectory for vehicles. But if you don't have clean electricity, none of those pieces really work. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, a key intervention is greening your electricity system.
Well, and interesting that you mentioned nuclear as an option, a viable option, with Ontario's getting 40% of their electricity through nuclear. It's obviously a viable option in terms of a clean energy source. So folks,
highly debated option.
Absolutely, granted. Yep. And we'll just wait a bit more time for folks to pose questions. But in the interim, while we're giving folks a chance to pose questions, any kind of parting thoughts that you want Albertans to think about as far as governments in Alberta, Yuill?
I mean, I think the biggest, I didn't go into this as much as I perhaps could have, but I think that this is the transition to a low carbon economy is a major opportunity. I think that's the biggest observation, and it requires a lot of innovation, entrepreneurship, investment, because you're taking one system and you're shifting the way it works, and that always requires a lot of work. So it's a major opportunity. It's not going to happen on its own without guidance from public policy, although a lot of the pieces are happening very quickly, like decreasing costs of renewable energy, electric vehicle uptake, etc. But it definitely needs to be steered, and I think to ensure that it provides benefits to everyone and not just a few, public policy will be critical.
Well, I guess another question that I would pose to you, or give you an opportunity, Yuill, is to give the folks a little bit of a background on the company SSG.
Right. So we're actually a cooperative. We've been around for 15 plus years, and we're decentralized across Canada. We have all different disciplines working within the co-op, from engineers to planners to educators, etc. And our work focuses on city planning, public policy, the built environment as a system, so both buildings and transportation within the built environment. And we're always, I think we're focused on being a little bit on what one of my colleagues calls the bleeding edge. So we're always learning new things and trying to apply those new things.
So whereabouts are your offices located, Yuill?
Well, we have offices in BC, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and then we have various people floating around in points in between.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, certainly you've got Canada covered. No offices in the US.
We have one person in New York.
Oh, well, right on. Excellent. Well, this has been a fascinating presentation, Yuill, and of course we'll be posting it to the YouTube channel, and folks, you can find that presentation if you search within YouTube for MCCAC, and Yuill's just put up his contact information there for you. So this has been a wonderful presentation, Yuill. Thanks so much for agreeing to do this.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and good luck with all of your future presentations.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Yuill.
Okay.
Bye now.
Okay, bye.